if you look at the way that entrepreneurs operate, they don't just run around like headless chickens, flailing around. Every entrepreneur has their own processes, their own systems. They test those over time. They refine those in experimental manners. They are very quick when they realize that the system isn't working, just to throw it out totally and start again from scratch. These are all intelligent behaviors that evolve in biology and are not possible for computers. They're not the way that computers work at all. Computers, as we've talked about, can operate in terms of randomness and in terms of symbolic logic, but they can't operate in terms of these thoughtful, intentional, novel actions and novel behaviors.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Most of us have been taught that business success comes from reason, logic, data, analysis, and prediction. Yet when uncertainty hits, these tools often fail. In this episode, Angus Fletcher explains that we've misunderstood how intelligence really works and why entrepreneurs thrive not by predicting the future, but by creating it in the form of a story that only they can tell. In this conversation, you'll learn why your brain is actually built for uncertainty, how to use fear and anxiety as signals instead of obstacles, why trying to think like a computer weakens entrepreneurs instead of helping them, and how your most valuable capability of all, intuition, really works.
This is the Value Creators Podcast, your source for a new kind of business education, escaping from business administration mode and entering dynamic entrepreneurship mode. We're guided by entrepreneurial economics, which is the source of all growth and positive change for businesses of all sizes in all markets. We talk to experienced experts in value creation so that there's business learning for you in every episode.
Angus, welcome to the Value Creators Podcast.
I am honored to be here, Hunter. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's our special pleasure, and we're going to be talking about a subject that's very close to us. Your book, Primal Intelligence, tells us that we've been taught wrongly about intelligence. We've been taught about logic and reason and objectivity and the scientific method, and that's not right. So let's make that the beginning. Tell us what's wrong with that and what's primal intelligence as the alternative.
Well, to be clear, I do believe in the scientific method. I just don't believe in logic. So what I believe is that intelligence evolved in the human brain to allow us to be smart with very little information. And the reason for that is the brain evolved in very volatile, changing environments where there just wasn't a lot of durable data. So the brain had to figure out another way to be smart. How do you figure out another way to be smart? Well, you activate things like intuition and imagination. You try things, you test them just like a scientist would. You see what works and you learn rapidly through feedback. So that's the way that our brains evolved to be intelligent. But unfortunately, we live in a world where there's something known as the computer, which is a very useful tool that can operate in a limited number of situations where there is vast amounts of reliable data. That's great. Unfortunately, those situations are rare in life, yet we are trying to train kids to think like computers, business people to think like computers, everybody to think like computers. We're now acting as though somehow computers through artificial intelligence are going to replace human intelligence. And that's where we've gone badly awry. And that's why you start to see people get stressed and panicked when volatility spikes, even though our brain can be very, very smart in volatility.
Yeah, so we think of that as the entrepreneurial method. And the reason for that anxiety, that panic, as you say, is uncertainty. You can't know the future. And so in that sense, you can run the experiments like the scientific method, but you have no idea what's going to happen. And you've got to do that without that knowledge. So we think of what you're talking about very much as applying to the future.
Yeah, the future is the one thing that we don't know. For sure, and this idea that anxiety evolved in the human brain. If you want, I can talk about the mechanics of this, but the anxiety evolved in the human brain to detect unknown unknowns. And those are different from known unknowns, which you can program into a computer. A computer can look for known unknowns. But anxiety evolved to detect unknown unknowns. And the higher the density of those, the more volatility there is. And the further you look into the future, that's why the more anxious you get, because there's just more unknown unknowns. And so anxiety is this incredible tool that evolved to be used for entrepreneurs, but also just for regular folks to help you gauge how uncertain your environment is, because That uncertainty then dictates to you how adaptive and how aggressive your adaptations need to be.
Well, let's talk about the pillars of primal intelligence that you mentioned a lot in the book. I think it'd be helpful for people to recap them, the four major pillars, and then we'll try and relate them to business entrepreneurship. So tell us about the four pillars.
So these four pillars evolved through my work with U.S. Army Special Operations, various classified units whose job it is to go into these chaotic, uncertain, volatile environments where you start out with a plan, but as you say, Hunter, the plan breaks almost immediately, and you've got to keep spinning up new plans aggressively to start to influence your situation and push it in the direction that you want. So through working with these U.S. Army teams, what we discovered is that there are four basic processes, powers that the brain runs to be able to plan effectively in volatility. The first power is intuition. The second power is imagination. The third power is common sense. And the fourth power is emotion. Intuition identifies emergent opportunities. So that's what helps you spark new plans. Imagination takes those sparks and branches them, multiplying plans so that you always have a roster of different plans that you're keeping alive at every moment. So you're never trapped on a single course, but you always feel like you've got flexibility in your future. Common sense helps you pick the best plan for your situation. So if you've got 45 different clever ideas, which one do you execute? And then emotion helps you pick the plan that's right for you, because each of us has our own life narrative, or to put it in a corporate sense, each business has its own character. Each business has its own story. So a product or service that might work for another business isn't going to work for your business because it's going against your core brand. And emotion is what kind of tells you, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel right. And the more you understand about how emotion is working, the more you can kind of tune that so that you're picking plans that work for your company.
Well, let's dive into each of those from an entrepreneurial way of thinking. So, intuition. I was just reading another book by Laura Wang, which I'm sure you're familiar with, called Intuition. She says intuition's a process, and then gut feel is the moment of clarity at the end of the intuition process that says, let's do this. Do you think of intuition that way as a process?
So I totally fundamentally disagree with that earlier way of thinking about intuition. So that way of thinking about intuition, it's basically the same way that Daniel Kahneman thinks about intuition, and it's the way that computers and computer scientists think about intuition. So what is that earlier way of thinking about intuition? That earlier way of thinking about intuition is that it's a pattern match, that essentially your brain is got tons and tons of data in it, and then when it sees a pattern repeat in your environment, it says, aha, I can match what's happening in my environment to something that I already know. Now, pattern matching is a real process. It's something that the brain can do. We can talk about where that comes from. But that is not intuition. And the reason we know this is because computers have no intuition whatsoever. Mm-hmm. They totally fail at intuition tests. And computers are incredibly good at pattern matching. So if it was about pattern matching, computers would be beating us at intuition. Meanwhile, young children have very good intuition and have much less information or data about the world than adults do. So that's not the explanation. The explanation for what intuition is it's actually the opposite of a pattern match. It's detecting an exception to a rule. And we found this working with special operators. Special operators were able to go into environments and say, oh, you know what, something's different. Something is not actually fitting our pre-existing protocols. And when something is not fitting, what that's telling you is that there is an emergent threat or opportunity. That's the thing that's most critical for any entrepreneur, is not to match a pattern, because that's telling you that the present is repeating the past. Instead, it's to identify something that's totally new, an anomaly, a singularity, because that's telling you, here is something that the world has never encountered before. And that's a chance for me as the entrepreneur to get out ahead of everybody else and make an innovation. So I fundamentally disagree with that earlier way of thinking about intuition, because it's again part of this computer thing that has trapped people. And that whole way of thinking, that computer way of thinking, as we're talking entrepreneurially, I mean, that's the basis of economic systems like communism. Mm-hmm. I mean, communism is rooted in the idea that if you just get enough data together, you can analyze it statistically. The Soviet Union was the first government to establish a Bureau of Statistics and 5-year plans, which were based on the idea that if you just crunched all this data, you could have this supreme, rational, enlightened being tell everybody what to do. And that doesn't work because life is a contested space. It's evolving. It's fragile. It's uncertain. It requires individual, entrepreneurial, imaginative initiative. So I don't agree with that older approach to intuition. I do agree in pattern matching, but I think that's of limited utility for entrepreneurs. I think really what makes entrepreneurs succeed is their ability to spot new opportunities.
Good, that's really helpful. I'll stop reading that book. But there's another concept that we use, and perhaps we'll get closer here, and I'm looking for your help, is insight. So we talk about insight when you're trying to examine a market or a facet of demand or the opportunity for an innovation. An insight is, I think, what you just talked about, a piece of unusual information that you can dig into and find out what's the motivation or what's the cause behind. I'm not sure we believe causal, but that is it. Am I close?
That's exactly right. So the Army calls this exceptional information. It calls anomalies exceptional information. And when you spot a piece of exceptional information, what your brain is telling you is there's an unseen cause here. There's a fundamental law of my environment that I'm not detecting. And that fundamental law might just be something that no one else has seen before, or it might have just emerged as a result of a change in conditions. So the rules of any environment can change. Just like, if you're playing a sport, if your opponent suddenly innovates, they come up with something like the forward pass or the West Coast offense or whatever in American football, then all of a sudden they've created a new rule, and then you've got to respond to that emergent rule. So yes, when you spot a piece of exceptional information or an anomaly, that triggers your brain to think, why did that happen? It's breaking all the existing rules. And then the next thing it's triggering your brain to think is, well, what if? What could happen now differently? What fresh ways of acting are opened up by my discovery of that fundamental rule? And this is really what scientists do. This is what Darwin did when he discovered the law of natural selection. This is what Einstein did when he discovered the law of relativity, what Curie did when she discovered the law of radioactivity, is you're discovering this law which no one else has seen before, and then boom, it allows you to invent the atom bomb.
So that gets us, I think, to imagination. You imagine that future, right? And one of the things you point out is that you imagine lots of futures. Is that the right way
That's
to say
completely right. Yeah, because the way that the human brain works differently from a computer is a computer thinks in probability, whereas the human brain thinks in possibility.
it?
So if you're thinking in probability, what you're constantly doing is you're constantly pattern matching, and then you're identifying what you think is the most likely outcome. If you're thinking in possibility, you're saying what could happen that hasn't happened before. And there's lots of things that could happen that haven't happened before. And so instead of just converging on a single probability, your brain starts to multiply possibilities. And then what it starts to do is it starts to say, okay, well, what sequence of actions can I take to accelerate one of those possibilities? And that's when you start not seeing the future, but making the future. Because as any entrepreneur knows, the best way to predict the future is to make it. And so that's really what your imagination is doing, is it's helping you tell a story that hasn't been told before, a new story of the future. That's why we see in the brains of leaders, the same parts that go active in a leader's brain are the parts of the brain that go active in a screenwriter's brain or in a novelist's brain. It's that telling of that future story through imagination and then acting faster to make it happen.
But you say, and I'm quoting here, that imagination helps define the strategy. It's a source of vision. So that sounds like narrowing the possibilities. Is that right?
Well, if you're going to run a company, you can't go in 85 directions at the same time. So what you've got to do is once you've started multiplying these stories, you've got to say, which of these stories is my company in the business of? And there's different ways to do that. In the book, what I suggest is that generally you use the third primal power, common sense, to identify which of the stories you want to use. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to do 8 things, you're doing nothing. And one of the main failures we discovered in sort of, would-be CEOs or would-be entrepreneurs is that they were unable to establish a single narrative that they were pursuing. They were trying to do 11 things at the same time. And as a result, they weren't getting anywhere on any of their stories. It's like if you were a novelist, you were trying to write 9 novels at the same time, you wouldn't get very far on any of them.
Yeah. So I think common sense relates to what entrepreneurial theory calls judgment, which I think it's the same thing. It's the ability to make decisions in the face of all this uncertainty and have the wherewithal and the constraints and the intelligence to do that. So does judgment sound like common sense?
Yeah, so I have a chapter in the book where I talk about decision making and how decision making is one way of using common sense. But broadly, common sense is your ability to match your action to your environment. And so how do you do that? Well, the way you do that if you're a computer is probabilistically, But as we've already discussed, that doesn't work in volatile environments. So that the way the human brain evolved to do it is the human brain evolved to think the newer my environment, the newer my plan has to be. In other words, if I'm in a familiar environment, I can probably do something that's worked before in the past. I could actually ask AI for its opinion because this is a familiar situation. So AI probably could give me a decent answer. But the newer my environment, the more that I have to take a risk and myself try something new. Because the one thing I know about this environment is that what worked in the past is not going to work now. And so common sense is your way of knowing when to take risks. So it's a little bit different from judgment, which is usually, I would say, about picking between, multiple options. Whereas common sense is basically your brain's way of measuring how aggressive do I have to be. And in the modern world, what we know is that the more volatile things are, the more conservative people tend to get. And that's bad. Actually, the more volatile that things get, the more your common sense is telling you, you've got to innovate. You've got to get on the front foot. You've got to try and match the pace of events.
But in judgment, we think of that action as an experiment. There's a term that entrepreneurs use called absolute uncertainty, which is, I don't know what to put in. I don't know what will come out if I do. So all you can do is pick an experiment and see what happens and try and refine that.
Well, okay, again, that's a computer way of thinking. So how do computers think? Computers mix logic with randomness. And this is the basis of brainstorming. It's the basis of ideation. It's the basis of design thinking. It's the basis of divergent and convergent thinking. And so sort of what you've just pitched to me is I have no idea what's going to happen, so I'm just going to randomly try something. That's not really the way that the human brain usually works. The way the human brain usually works is it usually says, I've got 6 or 7 things that I think I could do. The human brain does not have an infinite number of options in its mind. There's 6 or 7 things it thinks it could do. And then it measures each of them in terms of how new those things are. Is this really a big risk? And in an environment that's really volatile, the brain says, I'm going to go with my biggest risk because that's the thing that's most likely to work. And so actually there's a lot of intelligence at the bottom of it. It's not just random. And even though you don't exactly know what's going to occur, you do know that the more that you take risks in a volatile environment, the more that you're catching up to the speed of that environment. And the better you're going to be able to gauge the effectiveness of the things that you're doing. That's how it works, as I said, in military environments. We find that operators, when they're put in volatile environments that quickly innovate, tend to succeed much better than operators who act in a conservative manner. And so it's not just a kind of randomness. There really is a deeper intelligence there.
So more aggressive risk-taking for more volatility.
That's exactly right.
Wow. Okay. That's very instructive. It must be, well, I mean, it's hard to do, right? I mean, as you say, the opposite is the instinct.
Yeah, it is hard to do, but if you talk to any entrepreneur who's successful, that's what they did. I mean, what entrepreneurs do is when things are stable, they optimize. So in other words, when they've got a business plan that's working well, they ramp up the productivity of it. They enter their growth cycle. They start doubling down on what has worked. But when things aren't working, they start taking risks and quickly. And every entrepreneur knows that that's the way to succeed. And every entrepreneur knows that the reason that most people are not entrepreneurs is because most people do the opposite. Most people, when they get nervous, they want someone else to help them. Mm-hmm. They look for assistance, whereas the entrepreneur says, I know that there's no one that can help me. I've got to jump into the unknown.
Right. So maybe that's the opportunity to weave in emotion. Again, in entrepreneur theory, you think of emotion 2 ways. One, that it's behind the choices that our customers are making, that there's a lot of emotion in choice. But then the outbound from the entrepreneur we call empathy, the ability to understand that emotion on the customer's part. Is any of that close to right?
So we reject empathy, and the reason, and I can talk about that. There's lots of reasons for that. The main reason we reject empathy is because it suggests that there's something psychic is happening, essentially. That somehow, like, I'm mind reading people. I have this power called empathy. And then if you ask people, no, to explain it, they'll say, well, no. What I believe is EQ, and what EQ really means is that my ability to understand my emotions allows me to identify those emotions in other people. And identity is, again, another logic process, which is why EQ and IQ essentially operate the same way. And that's something that a computer can do. And we know that computers are actually very, very bad at having empathy or any of these things. So what we know from working with special operators is that emotion is actually a good tool for you to analyze your own mental processes. And it's a good way of helping you understand where your brain is breaking down, essentially. and allows you to pinpoint errors and faults. You can think of it as kind of like a dashboard on your car when things start to light up. So, for example, when your anger lights up, what that's telling you is that your future is narrowing. And instead of seeing a whole bunch of possible things that you can do, you're starting to feel trapped. And you're starting to feel like there's maybe only one thing you can do. And that's starting to make you feel aggressive. Why did your brain evolve to think this way? Well, because we know that the more assertively you act a plan, the more likely it is to work. So when your brain finds that it only has one plan, it starts to get aggressive. It starts to get angry because it thinks this is my only chance to get out of the situation. When you start feeling fear, that's your brain telling you you have no idea what to do. And the reason that your brain evolved that is because fear makes you susceptible to influence. And that's your brain's way of taking a plan from the people around you. This is why children get scared very easily, because this is their way of adopting adult influence. This is why repressive regimes try and make everyone scared so they can basically control them. So that's how anger, that's how fear work. And there's other emotions that are kind of working the same way in your brain. But the point is that your emotions are not in any way giving you any indication of what other people are thinking. And the more that you start to think that way, the more you start to enter into kind of like some magical world of wizardry. And the more that you understand that instead your emotions evolve to help you understand what's going on in your own brain, or to render transparent and legible the kind of deeper processes of your own psychology, that's when you can start to lean into them and use them instead of just dissociating from them or rationalizing them away.
So that's why you call emotion a decision-making system.
Yeah, well, emotion helps you identify when it is that you yourself need to start to speed up your thinking. So, for example, if you're starting to get angry or scared, what that's saying to you is activate your intuition, activate your imagination, start opening the number of opportunities you have. What we see with young people, because I teach in a college, young people are experiencing just this tsunami of fear. They're really scared. And what that's doing is that's making them dependent on adults. And so all these young people are going to adults and saying, help me, tell me what to do. And adults don't know what to tell young people to do because young people are entering a different world. And the things that succeeded for the adults aren't going to succeed for the young people. So we've got to create educational systems that help young people realize that when they feel scared, actually don't ask for help. Look within yourself to start to fire up that entrepreneurial spirit and start to imagine new possibilities and start to try them and test them. Because if you're feeling scared, what that's telling you is that you don't have the answer, so it's time to go make it for yourself.
But in an entrepreneurial context, what's the intelligence that I use to try and understand the motivation of my customer? So it's not empathy, but I need to at least have a thesis about what's making them make decisions. We say they don't know what they want, but they're uneasy about what they've got, and therefore that's an opening. So what's the alternative to empathy?
That's the first power. That's intuition. So basically what intuition does is it allows you to identify what's unique or special about each customer. It allows you to, because otherwise you don't need an explanation. If a customer is familiar to you from previous customers, right? There's no questions, no concerns about it. You just do with them what you've done with the previous customers. That's your common sense. But if something unusual is happening, that's when you need to activate your intuition and start to spot what's special. So we did a whole thing, I talk about this in the book, with salespeople, for example. And we noticed that very experienced salespeople, when they burn out, the way to get them back on track is to reactivate their intuition. And one way to help them reactivate their intuition is to get them to start to ask questions like who, what, when, where, how, but not why. Because when you're asking that first set of questions, you're surfacing details. But when you're asking why, you're jumping to a judgment, you're jumping to a decision. And really what you want to be doing when you're confronted with a person who you don't understand is surfacing more information about them before you jump to a judgment. And so it's always intuition that's going to help you kind of start to figure out what's going on with your customers. And then to your question about how do you determine why and what if, that's then imagination is going to start to help you take those new sort of intuitions that you detected and start to run the story part of your brain to model those individuals as characters and start to say to yourself, what's the possible reason that they're behaving this way? And the reason this matters is because the way you get better at these processes is not by working on your emotions. The way you get better at these processes is by reading memoirs or looking at art or doing other things that spark intuition and imagination, as opposed to engaging in processes that help you process emotion.
Yeah, this is all very fascinating because the opposite, as we started with, of what we've been taught. So we were always taught the 5 whys. Keep asking people why.
That's
Eventually
right.
you'll get to it.
It's a disaster. That's a total disaster. And I can tell you why that's a disaster. So the 5 whys were invented to help people troubleshoot assembly lines. And what's the thing about an assembly line? An assembly line was built by you. You built your assembly line. So you actually understand all the mechanics of it. So when you're asking all those whys, what that's helping you do is go through your own decision-making plan and process and design. When you're talking to another person, did you invent them? Did you create their psyche? Did you build all the mechanics of their mind? No. So if you ask why, all you're going to do is surface your assumptions or their assumptions. So asking why, you got to get out of that mindset. You got to get way out of that mindset. And, part of the reason that we discovered this is we were working with military interrogators. And so these are individuals whose job it is to, bring in individuals who have valuable information. And those individuals who have that information oftentimes are trying to conceal the information, or might, want to some way kind of manipulate the process in some ways. And so how is it that military interrogators are able to rapidly surface the important information? Is they stay away from those why questions and instead focus on who, what, when, where questions. And the more that those answers given to you by the person contradict or cause surprises, the more you continue asking those questions about it, so you can start to surface the full picture. And that, again, that process of surfacing information before you jump to a why, asking why never surfaces information. It just surfaces judgments.
We're delighted to announce the Value Creators online course. For entrepreneurs in every kind of business, big, small, or medium, at every stage, in every industry, our course provides the foundations and principles on which to build success. Simple, clear purpose and principles give rise to creativity, innovation, and competitively superior business action. There are 11 foundational principles or mental models that together cohere into the value business model. Principles for value generation, principles for value operations, principles for value finance and accounting, and principles for value sustainability, as well as the new knowledge accumulation you'll need for continuous innovation. These principles are delivered by top business professors from top business schools: Mark Packard, Per Byland, Gordon Miller, David Rapp, and Bart Vanderhagen. You'll find video lessons from them, along with downloadable tools, processes, and other valuable content. Master these lessons, and you'll master the most important skill in business: value creation. Go to thevaluecreators.com and click the course link.
Yeah. So this idea of the shift, Angus, another shift is in neurology, and you're a neurologist. And you say the way we've been taught to think about how the brain works is wrong. It thinks in story, if I can use that as a prompt. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so my ultimate background is in a branch of neuroscience known as neurophysiology. And I basically started out studying individual neurons. And when you are taught about neurons in school, you're often taught that they operate like a transistor, that they're either on or they're off, and then you get a bunch of these neurons together, and they activate each other, and they create these sort of patterns of activity and so on and so forth. That's not at all how neurons work. Neurons act independently of input. So if you leave a neuron alone, it'll keep acting. The way that a neuron thinks is not in terms of packets of data like a computer does. The way that a neuron thinks is in terms of actions. Why? Well, because ultimately your brain is like a giant muscle, and its job is to create new actions, new behaviors. Why? Because that's what allows you to survive in the world, your ability to come up with new ways of behaving, new ways of acting. The brain didn't survive by coming up with new correlations or new concepts or new ideas. It survived by coming up with new plans, new behaviors, new actions. And so once you start to understand that, you start to realize that a neuron's job is to initiate action, so to create a new action, that a chain of neurons together is a chain of new actions. A chain of new actions is a plan or a narrative. And so basically the brain evolved to think in stories and then figure out, how do I make those stories real? Because if I can create a story of the future and then make that story happen faster than the people around me, then I am creating the future, as opposed to what computers do, which is they try and predict the future, not make it.
Mm-hmm. So that gets us back to entrepreneurship. We always try to think of it as action, not anything else. It's just doing. So
it is doing, but of course, I'm sure any entrepreneur will tell you, again, it's intelligent action. It's not just random action. Like if you just If you look at the way that entrepreneurs operate, they don't just run around like headless chickens, flailing around. Every entrepreneur has their own processes, their own systems. They test those over time. They refine those in experimental manners. They are very quick when they realize that a system isn't working, just to throw it out totally and start again from scratch. These are all intelligent behaviors that evolved in biology and are not possible for computers. They're not the way the computers work at all. Computers, as we've talked about, can operate in terms of randomness and in terms of symbolic logic, but they can't operate in terms of these thoughtful, intentional, novel actions and novel behaviors.
So let me try out another shift on you, Angus, that we're experimenting with, and that's the philosophical shift. And I'm on dangerous ground here because I'm not a trained philosopher, but I know some of the words. And that's a shift from positivism, which, roughly speaking, is exactly what we started with. It's about everything has to be quantified and logical and so on, to what we like to call subjectivism, but it might not be the right word. But it admits all of the emotion and imagination and intuition that you're talking about. And that in business, we think that's the difference between what they teach in school as business administration, which is positivist, and entrepreneurship, which is much more subjectivist. Intelligent, certainly, but different from logical positivism. So let me try that out on you. What do you think of that theory?
Well, I might be even more radical than you, and I would just say let's throw out philosophy entirely. Philosophy has been around for thousands of years. It's unclear what it's done for us. I would say the key to success in life is to stop thinking logically and to start thinking biologically. And when you start thinking biologically, it's going down exactly the road you're talking about. You're starting to think practically. The term in philosophy is actually technically pragmatism. So if you want to read, William James and the pragmatists, I mean those individuals, they start from the assumption that Darwin broke philosophy. There's a series of famous articles written at the end of the 19th and early 20th century by pragmatists about why Darwinism essentially gets rid of everything that philosophers had thought up to that point. And once you embrace a Darwinist system, what you start to realize is that actually life is about conflict. That's what markets are about. They're about conflict. They're about struggling. They're about trying to evolve faster than your competitors. And the key to intelligence is essentially figuring out how to outflank your competitors by beating them to opportunities or by solving problems faster than they can. And so, that's the way that I encourage young people to think. And if you don't like Darwin, you can go back before Darwin to Clausewitz, who's the kind of the originator of modern theories of war. And he says essentially the same thing. And both Darwin and Clausewitz essentially come out of romantic traditions that reject the Enlightenment, which is the progenitor of positivism,
Right.
and instead are focused on the idea of struggle, individuality, imagination, genius, all these kinds of things, which ultimately come to us in the West from Shakespeare.
How do you feel about economics? Can we keep economics?
I mean, I think the Nobel Prize in economics is a scam. I mean, I think that, in general, when you look at many Nobels that are handed out in medicine or biology or whatever, they're for these brilliant, brilliant insights, which have gone on to have radically improve human life. And the Nobel Prize in economics is largely handed out to individuals who are totally catastrophically wrong, who have handed us these weird sort of overconfident rationalist theories about the way that economies work that have been disastrous when enacted at scale. So I would encourage people to shut down the Nobel Prize in economics. I would encourage people to put a lot less faith in economists. And again, shifting away from logic, which is, and data analysis and all this kind of, looking for correlations and quantifications and whatnot, all the stuff that goes on in econ departments, hand that stuff over to biologists. You'll find that biologists are much more humble. Biologists are much more open to new things. Biologists are much more imaginative. I really think a world run by biologists as opposed to economists. And, biologists, and I think, and entrepreneurs have a lot in common in the sense that they're both about valuing the unusual, the strange, the outlying, and coming up with rules for explaining that, but not being overconfident and not trying to sort of come up with these overarching structuralist explanations for things. I mean, nudges, for example. This is something that economists have given us, these idea of nudges, which are not only, I think, wrong, but also really creepy. The
Right.
idea that we could create these choice
Yeah.
architectures and somehow manipulate people into behaving in certain ways. I mean, to me, that just sounds like I'm part of some like weird autocratic experiment. I dislike all of that stuff. And I'm much more on the side of the individual, of Thoreau, of writers, of artists, and of entrepreneurs.
So is complex adaptive systems theory helpful here, where it's all about interaction of individuals, but then great emergent properties result from that?
Again, that is a kind of, I think, weird overreaching theory that's attempting to systematize how individuals operate. The whole point about the interaction between individuals is that it's asymmetric and therefore unpredictable. And the thing about all these complex systems theories is they're essentially statistical. And what they try and do is they try and basically generalize individuals into these sort of,
Types. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, and bell curves.
Mhm.
And that is just not helpful when really life is won by the outliers. And sure, to a certain extent, if you stand far enough away from the stars and you look at them, all the stars look the same. That's what people thought in the Middle Ages. They thought all the stars were the same. But once you actually start to get close to stars, you start to realize each star is totally different in the sky. And it's the same with individuals. And I really think that the whole purpose of America and the purpose of democracy and the future of a healthy economy is to treat every individual as an individual and realize that when you start to engage in these statistical approaches, you're dehumanizing your customers, you're dehumanizing individuals, and you're ultimately limiting the possibilities for innovation.
Yeah. Amen to that on individualism. So education, Angus, can people learn, young people especially, learn primal intelligence? Can we help them? Does education have a role? How would you approach that?
Yeah, I think, but we would have to change education. And, our current education system is really run over with standardized testing and other forms of assessment, which are really attempting to turn kids into little computers, making them memorize things, making them take math tests, attempting to sort of generalize and sort individuals by labeling them. The reason I got started with the book is I was fascinated by the fact that U.S. Army Special Operations has developed a whole training system which is about cultivating individuals and about unleashing the capacity of individuals to have intuition and to have imagination and to act in situations that their teachers and instructors never predicted. So that what you see now with kids is kids get more and more dependent on school, so that when they have a hard time finding a job, what do? They go back to school rather than what they should do, which is start their own business. And what's incredible about special operations is that special operations says, no, actually, the purpose of school is to deconstruct itself. And actually, what we want to do as a teacher is make ourselves rapidly redundant. And so the way that we do this in schools, and we've taken special operations training and put it into schools for kids as young as 8, one of the things that we do is we say what should happen in the classroom is that teachers should not bring in questions or problems that they know the answers to. So as a teacher, you're not allowed in a classroom, in a primal classroom, to get up there and write 2 + 2 = question mark, because you as a teacher already know the answer to that. And what that's teaching the kids is the teacher has the answers. Therefore, we should be submissive to the system. Instead, as the teacher, you bring in questions that you don't have answers to. And the best way to do that is to ask the kids in the classroom, what questions do you have?
Mm-hmm.
What problems are you struggling with? And that totally decenters authority in the classroom, puts it in the hands of the kids. And then you can say to the students, did we answer your question satisfactorily? Did the tools that I gave you answer those questions? And that's the way that U.S. Army Special Operations works. That's the way that education can work. And, here at Ohio State, we're building a new leadership institute that is really focused on training young folks to think more like special operators, but giving them the tools to lead themselves and make themselves independent of the classroom.
Yeah, we're trying to think of the idea of entrepreneurial leadership, which is the opposite of administrative leadership. And then I like your phrase, it's about the questions that don't currently have an answer and how do we approach those?
Yeah, and this is, again, another one of the fictions, is that if you look at modern MBA programs, they claim to teach leadership. None of them teach leadership. They all teach management. Management is the opposite of leadership. Management is about optimizing existing plans. Who came up with those plans? A leader came up with those plans. And so if you really want to teach leadership, you have to teach initiative. You have to teach the ability to come up with new plans for new situations. And, the way that we have started to do that here in our facilities is, again, stealing the model from U.S. Army Special Operations, what U.S. Army Special Operations says is you can't teach someone how to be a leader, because the moment you try and teach them to be a leader, they are following. Instead, what you do is you identify in the brain what the common leadership failures are. So common failure, failure of initiative, failure of confidence, failure of strategic vision. Once you start to identify these failures, you help individuals spot when they themselves are having those failures and get out of them. And that way, instead of teaching people where to go, you're teaching them how not to fail. And so if they don't fail, they can then figure out their own paths forward, developing their own individual leadership style. So you're still teaching them something in school, but you're not teaching them what to do. You're teaching them what not to do.
Is there such a thing as leadership? Should we use that word? Because as you say, it always conjures in my mind that, well, there must be followers, and some people are going to be followers, and that's not a good thing. So
I love the word leadership, and I'll tell you why. The reason I love the word leadership is because working with special operations has made me realize you can have packs of leaders. So just imagine you've got 10 leaders in a room, and what they're all doing is they're trying to figure out the next step. And when one of them figures it out, the other 9 follow, because that's what it means to be a leader. Because as a leader, you don't have any ego. You don't have any desire to be first. You just have a desire to solve the problem. And if somebody else solves it faster than you, you go with them. But the important thing about everybody being a leader is you're maximizing all of the different brains you have, so that any of them at any moment could be the person who comes up with the answer, as opposed to having one person who is always and only the leader and then 9 followers. You see what I'm saying? So if you have a system, a dynamic system, a wolf pack system, as they call it in special operations, where at any moment, any wolf can be the one that leads the pack, that's what I favor. But I do think you need to have a leader, because if you don't have a leader, you end up usually just having a bunch of people who just sit around.
So a wolf pack of leaders, that's right. A great concept. Do they exchange leadership from time to time? At some point, I'm a leader, and sometimes you're a leader. Is that the way to think of it, or not?
Well, you could think about that in terms of getting to know each other, but ultimately the way that it works in a live situation is everybody follows the person who comes up with a better plan faster. So if you, me, and 8 other people were sitting in a combat situation, and you happen to be like, I think this is the way to go, and you started to go that way, and then the other 9 of us were like, that's a smart way, we would all just follow you. So you didn't have to be appointed ahead of time as a leader. We just waited there and saw who came up with the best plan. And it's the same way that the neurons work in your brain. There isn't a neuron in your brain that's appointed the leader. They're all working and trying to figure out what the best plan is. And when one of them comes up with it, all the other ones jump on board and amplify it. And that's how systems work most successfully, is when you allow maximum initiative and maximum autonomy to every individual in the environment. But then when one individual starts to distinguish themselves, you switch all the resources behind that person for the big push to power them through until you once again democratize for the next opportunity or challenge.
Well, we've got to rewrite the theories of entrepreneurship, I think, Angus. Can we talk you into shifting your research from special operators to entrepreneurs?
I'm not sure that I'm smart enough to be an entrepreneur. I'll be honest with you. It took me long enough to even begin to figure out what the special operators are doing, but I do certainly hope that entrepreneurs can benefit from the special operations research, and that entrepreneurs like you can kind of study what, I've been able to do with U.S. Army Special Operations and start to apply it to your own domains, because ultimately every individual is the master of their own domain. And it's taking these kinds of general ways of thinking that can be developed by special operators, but then applying them specifically to your market or your product or your process. I mean, that's really where victory happens.
I'm going to end with a quote that I loved from the book. You mentioned a couple of entrepreneurs like Jobs and Edison, and one of them is Nicholas Tesla. And he said, "We have finer fibers that enable us to perceive truths when logical deduction is futile." So that kind of summed it up. I've got to find my finer fibers.
Yeah, and then if you do, you can see the future faster, like Tesla did, and you can invent a world powered by a machine that no one in previous centuries had known.
Right. One last point. He was incredibly resilient too. He kept that belief through all kinds of setbacks, right? Decades of disbelief, and he just kept believing.
I mean, at one point he was literally shoveling in order to pay for his meals. He was working as a day laborer, and this was a genius. And I think it's important to remember that genius always inhabits the future. It does. And so a lot of times the smartest people out there can get very down on themselves, and they can think, oh, well, this isn't working. It's not working yet.
Mm-hmm.
but it can work in the future. And really the key is to start to figure out, how do I take those individual steps to get there? And that's really where genius goes from just being genius to being success, is when you can start to figure out, okay, here are the steps that carry me from the present to the future that only I can see. And Tesla was able to do that. Steve Jobs was able to do that. Van Gogh was able to do that at the very end of his life.
Mhm.
And I would say to anybody out there who's got that feeling right now, that you're seeing something that nobody else is seeing, hold on to that feeling and then just start to slow down and find the steps from now to there.
Well, Angus, thank you so much. As we say, we're going to rethink a lot of things as a result of your insights and your wonderful research. And just tell us about the science of story very quickly, because that's you call it a science, right?
Yeah, so I'm part of something called Project Narrative, which is here at Ohio State University. And we essentially believe that story did not evolve for communicating. And the reason that we believe this is we know that story goes back in the brain long before the emergence of language. It goes back hundreds of millions of years. And we're interested in studying on the level of individual neurons, how it is that neurons create stories. I've already said that another name for a story is a plot, another name for a plot is a plan. So how it is that, that your brain is constantly creating these possible plans for the future. And we do that through a variety of methods, which include embedding with companies, embedding with special operations, using brain scanners, other kinds of things like that. So it's kind of a mix of neurophysiology, neuroscience, and other branches like that, and then traditional narrative theory and other established kind of humanities methods for studying stories.
Wonderful. Well, Angus, thank you very much for today. You've given us a lot to think about. We've learned a lot.
Thank you, Hunter.
It's
been
been a real privilege to talk to you. Thank you.
Enjoy.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode. And check hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.